Mabrika, Hahom, Seneco Kakona, Daka Romeo, Arosel Natividad Miriam, Daka Taino. Welcome, thank you, and abundant blessings. I am Romeo of my grandmothers Miriam and Natividad, and I am Taino. But I didn't grow up knowing those words, because nobody did. Taino is a revived language, strung together from bits and pieces found through historical digging and intuitive knowing. Sometimes I feel how the linguists must feel, like I am piecing myself together through fragments, through the bits and pieces that I can find wherever I can, trying to figure out who the hell I am. I was born in 1993 to a Boricua mother and a Jewish father. For those that don't know, Boricua is the indigenous Taino name of a Puerto Rican. And that's important. My parents taught me to be really proud of who I am, even though they grew up in a time when interracial marriage was still very much taboo, especially in our Jewish community. But they taught me that I come from two peoples who fought very, very hard for their right to survive. And survive we did. And I am the product of that. And I am proud. I always had my mother in my ear, especially talking about the Tainos. She knew how important it was for me to grow up knowing my roots, because I am the first generation of people who really claim Taino after years and years of assimilation. My mother taught me a lot, and I don't always know exactly how she knew what she knew. She taught me about our words, that words in both English and Spanish come from our people, like hammock and hurricane. And she taught me that we were fishermen, that we lived in relative abundance, that we were creative and we were loving. She taught me that when the Spanish came, we met them with peace, that we treated them as our relatives until they tried to enslave us. And then we resisted. And then she taught me about the wars from the Spanish and the United States. Our ancestral land of Vieques was taken by the Navy. They leaked uranium everywhere and it made us sick. My mom taught me to be very, very proud that we survived, that it was very important that we are Taino. So imagine my surprise when I was 13 years old and assigned a school project to look into my own family heritage. Of course, I was more than ecstatic to go looking up things about my island of Puerto Rico. And I took out a couple books from my school library and I opened them up, and one of the first things I saw were the words, "The Taino are extinct." Extinct. After my mom taught me so much about how hard we fought for our existence, extinct. Those words hit me like nothing else ever had. And I took the books home to my mother and I said, "Mom, I thought we are Taino." She didn't even look at the book. She just looked at me and said, "Your textbook is wrong." She didn't have to say anything more than that because I knew the subtext to what she was saying. She was telling me that the war isn't over, that we are still fighting for our right to exist. So I started spending my life collecting evidence of who I am, in little bits and pieces, trying to string myself together just like our language. And one example is when one Thanksgiving, the most genocidal holiday that there is, I happened to be sitting on the floor of my sibling's house. We were making collages together. And I happened upon a National Geographic study that was conducted about the Taino people. And this was maybe like 7 years later, and I was intrigued to find that National Geographic was actually dispelling everything that my 8th grade textbook was telling me about Puerto Ricans. In contrast, they were talking about how the Taino actually have DNA in almost 60% of Puerto Ricans. And one way that they were looking at this is they were looking at the different skulls of people who live currently and people who lived way before colonization happened. And they noticed this particular characteristic. It's called a shovel-shaped incisor, which is where the back of a tooth has a divot in it. It's kind of shaped like a shovel, and that this is something that existed only in South and North America. And what they found is that many Puerto Ricans have this distinct type of tooth. Now, as I'm reading this, I feel my tongue reaching to the back of my teeth, and I feel my own shovel-shaped incisors reaching back to me. And this characteristic of mine that I always felt was some kind of mangled deformity, I finally felt proud of. I felt my ancestors living in my mouth. But things got more complicated, as Indigenous identity often does. I moved to Washington when I was 12, and I went to college there on traditional Lummi territory, and there aren't a lot of Puerto Ricans out there, so not a lot of Taínos to connect with. But there were a lot of Indigenous people. The Indigenous people of the West had much more time to prepare for colonization, and they were able to keep their traditions and their cultures alive in a way that the Taíno were not. And I learned very quickly that having DNA doesn't make you Indigenous. And that gets really complicated in the United States, where a lot of people want to claim their Indigenous ancestry but don't have access to their cultures and their traditions. And so I backed off a little bit of my own identity because I felt like I wasn't Taíno enough to really know what it means to be Taíno. And I spent the next couple years doing more digging, trying to find more things to put in my pocket, finding more remnants of the people that we were, finding more stories from my mother left in my body. And it wasn't until recently that I decided it would be very important for me to connect with other Taíno people, for me to find out who I am. And so it was really just a couple of weeks ago that I went to my first Taíno gathering with other Taíno people and Taíno elders. And as I was there, I felt myself longing to be taught something about what it means to be Taíno. I was longing to walk away knowing something more than I knew before. And as I'm sitting there, I become surprised to know that there's nothing new there, that my mother taught me well, that the stories and the history and the music that we played with maracas, it felt familiar and it felt like home. And what I found was that even the elders are piecing together everything they can to try and prove that genocide didn't take us, and that I am standing on the shoulders of many people doing the same thing as me. At the end of the gathering, I found myself talking to one of the elders, and I was so grateful and honored to be in his presence. He was one of the first people to really start the movement of the reclamation of the Taíno identity. And as we're talking, he looks at me and he says, "Why don't you try on my headdress?" And inside of me, I felt all of the doubt rushing back to me. I am not Taíno enough to even touch that. So I pull away from him and I say, "Isn't that sacred?" And he looks at me with the firmness and the tenderness that only an elder can have. And he says, "You are Taíno. Come here." And he wraps the headdress around my head. And in that moment, I felt all of the doubt shatter. And now, this was only a couple weeks ago, so I still have questions about who I am. But one thing I feel clear about is that my people survived a literal and a paper genocide. And I can't speak for any other Indigenous community because we all have very different ways of deciding who belongs and who doesn't, who counts and who doesn't. But for us Taíno, this is how we prove that colonization didn't win. And so for us, we have to claim ourselves. And for me, my people have claimed me. And I am Taíno.